the lines don't change their length, it's just the boat shifts its position. Now if your fenders are in the middle, you know, up here is going to start hitting the pontoon, which, you know, if you leave the boat could cause damage to the boat. It's not very cool. Yeah, so now if the tide goes from the opposite, it's awesome, isn't it? Tide, awesome. If the tide comes from the opposite direction, then she'll do that. Yeah, so that's also not good. So to stop that happening, we put on the spring lines like that. That's really important, especially if you're going to be there for any sort of long period of time, like overnight.
And do you put the bow on first if the tide's coming that way and the stern
Well, if the
on?
tide's coming that way,
Yeah.
that's the one you need to get on first.
Oh, yeah, because it's going to go.
Because that's to stop. That's stopping it from doing
Is that essential?
Absolutely, yeah.
But I mean, you'd do it all within a few minutes, wouldn't you?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
but it
Yeah,
is
it doesn't. You
essential.
don't need to get it on straight away.
Yeah.
Because whilst you're, you know, manoeuvring the boat alongside, the first thing you need to do is to get the bow and the stern line, and you've probably still got the engine running. And then, if necessary, you can motor forward slightly and position the boat and put your two spring lines on. But the first one to go on will always be the stern spring, and then you put the bow spring on like that. You can also bring them from the centre like that. It amounts to exactly the same thing. That's your bow spring. That's your stern spring. Okay, that's exactly the same. Then what we did when we were in Isla Canella, we rigged up the boat with just that bow spring, and the reason for that was that we had the wind there, if you remember. So if we just decided to leave with the wind on the beam, then of course what's going to happen with the wind pushing us alongside is that the fenders will roll out and we damage the side of the boat, because you can't just do that because the wind's pushing you alongside. So the only way off is really, unless you have a bow thruster, is to spring off. Now if you rig up a bow spring and then you motor against it and you put the rudder over here like that, so it's on hard lock, so you're steering into the pontoon, the thrust from the propeller over the rudder blade will push the back of the boat out, along with this kind of hinge action created by the spring and the boat itself. So what happens is you end up kicking the back of the boat out like that, and then when you're at a nice angle, one that you're happy with, then all you need to do is go to neutral, centre the wheel very quickly, or the tiller, and then you slip the spring line and reverse away. Yeah? If you're going the opposite way, I mean, you can go out that way and you reverse against the spring line, yeah? And then when you get at a nice angle, you just motor forward, slipping the line as you go. But whichever line you rig up, you've got to go against it. Yeah, you can't go forwards when you've got a stern spring, because it's not a rod. It's a piece of line. So you've got to, with a stern spring, you've got to reverse, and with a bow spring, you've got to go forwards against it to get that tension that you need to create that hinging action. All right. Ferry gliding. We did on Tuesday or Monday, whenever it was. Yeah. If you've got no tide at all, then you really want to come from about this sort of angle, which is 30 or 40 degrees, like that. Yeah. And then when you get to about half the boat's width, you think about the boat's width. This boat is nearly 4 meters. So when you get about 2 meters off here, just to give you some kind of point of reference, you then start to turn the boat so that she ends up parallel, and then you can step off and put your lines on. Very easy. Okay. If you've got tide, the problem coming from here is, at that angle, is that you'll do that. You'll miss. Yeah. So you either do that from over here and ferry glide like that, or you come in with a lot more speed and you do that, which of course doesn't give you quite the same level of control. So it's actually better to be a bit across or down slightly from the pontoon, and then with a low speed you ferry glide over to the pontoon, and then the same story. When you get to about half a boat width away from the pontoon, just bring the nose up into the tide, and then you can just gently steer her alongside. Now the beauty of doing it in a tide is that you can match the speed of the tide with the engine revs, and the boat will just stay there whilst you get your crew ashore. Without tide, as soon as you stop, the wind will blow you back. If you don't put the engine into neutral, you just keep going forwards. It's actually more difficult. Yeah? Once you've got this technique, it's very easy. Tides do not present a huge problem. If the tide was coming in this direction and the wind was coming from there, then obviously tide being a dominant factor, we'd have to come from over here. Okay, so we always put the front of the boat into the tide. Yeah,
Okay.
we go that way like that. Wind, remember, is not as dense as water, and it only affects 50% of the surface area above the water. That's where current affects 100% of the boat's surface below the water, and it's a lot denser. Yeah? So it's the tide that is the dominant factor.
So always a bow in
Into
the
the
direction
tide.
of the tide.
Yeah. Same when we're picking up a mooring, like, you know, yesterday we had the wind kind of here, like that, and we had the tide there. So actually what we were doing is we were doing something that was a bit like that, and the only reason we were doing that is so that we could get the sail out far enough to power it, but our track was towards the buoy,
But if you're
directly into the tide.
if you're in a marina, you don't have that choice necessarily, do you?
Well, yes and no, it depends. You know, it
If you were
depends on
just
the
given
marina.
a berth and it was the same way.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if like our berth in Villarreal, quite often the tide's going that way. So the only way I can go in there is either forwards or backwards, but it's down tide, which is actually very tricky. Because if you arrive down tide like that, to be stopped, you know, for example, if we went in forwards like that, to actually stop, we need to be going backwards through the water, which means that before we stop, we lose steerage, which we don't really want to do in a tight space. The ability to steer the boat.
Okay.
But
Yeah?
it happens, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, my berth is exactly that. I mean, if you think about it, if you come this way around, even alongside, if you've got the tide going that way, to stop at some point around about here, you lose control of the boat, because you've got to go from going forwards into actually reversing through the water. Because when you're stopped, the tide's going past you, you're going backwards through the water.
So you have to get a stern line on very quickly.